Hi, my name is Elizabeth. I'm a librarian at the Cosby Library and Community Commons. And in this video, I'll be giving you a few tips about quick pickles. This is a more American style vinegar pickle recipe. This was going to be part of the program that I gave at the end of February about freezer jams and quick pickles, and it turns out that we spent most of the time in the program on the freezer jams and didn't have time to talk much about the pickles. And then also we gave that program right after the big ice storm happened, so some folks were not able to join us, so I thought I'd just put together a quick video showing you a few things about quick pickles and then a short demonstration. American style quick pickles are very simple, and it's a lot of what your particular taste is. You know, what recipe you use is going to depend on how vinegary you like your pickles or how sweet you like your pickles. There's lots and lots of flexibility with these kinds of recipes. Where things get really interesting with pickles is internationally, and I did include some international pickle recipes with my recipe booklet. You can find that booklet in the original calendar listing at the end of February, February 2021. But I used, for example, the Korean soy sauce pickle recipe, and I've made some pickled eggs here. Now these are only going to last for a few days in the refrigerator, but I think they're really, really tasty. They remind me kind of the eggs that you get in ramen at a Japanese restaurant. You can find pickled pub eggs that were popular in Europe, so you can find recipes for that. You can find some recipes, international recipes that include pickled fruits, so things maybe from the Philippines or from India. They have some recipes that include fruit, and so you'll find all sorts of interesting ideas if you explore some of these more international recipes. But of course, the traditional pickles that we think of here are going to be pickled cucumbers. And you have a few choices when it comes to cucumbers. So I just found two things here at the grocery store that I wanted to show you. So the typical cucumber that you're going to see at a grocery store that you think of when you picture a cucumber is called a garden cucumber. And you can use those for pickling. They do come waxed most of the time, so if you're not buying them, straight from the farmer at the farmer's market, those cucumbers are probably going to be waxed. And there is some evidence to suggest that that wax can contain a lot of contaminants and pesticides, so you really want to be very careful to wash those cucumbers really well if you're going to use a garden cucumber. But I think they pickle just fine. You'll find a lot of recipes that claim, don't use this or this kind of cucumber, or, they just won't make good pickles. And then you'll find another recipe that will just contradict that completely. So for example, one of those cucumbers is this English cucumber, and you might also find Persian cucumbers that are packaged like this. They're really similar cucumbers. They're pretty much seedless. They have a really very mild flavor, and you'll see a lot of, especially American style recipes that say, do not use English or Persian cucumbers for pickling. But you know what? They work just fine, and this is a really common cucumber to use in Asian recipes. You will find packages at the store that are actually called pickling cucumbers, or mini cucumbers in this case. I don't know if this means that this is a miniature version of a garden cucumber. They don't look like Kirby's, which are really bumpy, and which are kind of the typical pickling cucumber. But on the back of this package, it does include a recipe for pickles. Interestingly, this pickle recipe does not include any water, which for most people is going to be way too strong of a pickling solution. So again, you're going to have to kind of experiment and see what works best for you. This one also does not include any step where you warm the brine, which most pickle recipes will include a step where you sort of warm the brine to melt the sugar or dissolve the sugar, and it seems to help the brine penetrate the vegetables a little bit more. So your big thing here is going to be prepping the vegetables. Of course, smaller pieces are going to pickle better, are going to pickle faster. You're going to need to experiment a little bit with what kinds of seasoning you like. So mustard seeds, peppercorns, dill, garlic, those are really common seasoning additions. You can find recipes, and I included one in the booklet for, make your own pickling spice that might include things like bay leaves and some other seasonings. Some of those international recipes, or even some US ones for things, especially like beets, included things that you might more associate with desserts, like cinnamon, for example, or clove. And those are really interesting recipes to try. Make sure that whatever container you use, you do want to use probably a glass container for pickles, because plastic can absorb the odors from the vinegar and the other seasonings that you use. You don't necessarily need to use a canning jar. We are not going to be canning, so this is not going to be shelf stable. So you will have to keep these pickles in the refrigerator. Depending on how clean all of your equipment is and how clean your utensil is when you go to dip out of your pickles. Pickles made in this manner can last for anywhere from a few days, in the case of something like maybe these eggs, up to several weeks in the refrigerator. You're just going to have to kind of keep an eye on it and make sure you don't see any kind of contamination or any spoilage starting in your pickles. But these are not meant to be stored in the pantry, so do not store any of these kinds of quick pickles in the pantry. They will not last. You can use fresh or dried dill. I think the fresh is very pretty, so I'm going to show you a recipe where everything is very visually appealing and it's nice for like a potluck or to bring to a family dinner. I'm also going to show you my favorite recipe that I found, which is the pickled mushroom recipe. A few other little tips: be sure and use non-iodized salt. So the iodized salt can make your pickling solution kind of cloudy. That's why most of these recipes are going to call for sea salt or pickling salt, which is non-iodized. Make sure, again, that you cut your pieces of vegetables into pretty small pieces, and if your vegetables are something like green beans or something that's going to kind of turn grayish looking when you cook them, you want to blanch those first. We're actually going to cook the mushrooms first. So mushrooms are one of those things that you will cook before you pickle them. But blanching is just very quickly kind of flash cooking your vegetables, and that preserves the color. But you don't need to do that for most things. That's mostly going to be things, again, like maybe okra or green beans, things that, you know, based on your experience, you sort of know those things change color when you cook them. So make sure that you do a little bit of research ahead of time, you know, on what recipe you think will work the best with the item that you're going to be using, the vegetable that you're going to be using, and make sure that you think about, you know, what kinds of flavor profiles you like. The other thing I want to mention is that if you do use something like cucumbers that has a lot of moisture in them, many Asian recipes will actually recommend, and cabbage is another vegetable, by the way, too. Many Asian style recipes and many European style recipes, in the case of cabbage, will recommend that you sprinkle salt over your vegetables after you cut them and let them sit for a little while, 30 minutes up to overnight. And a lot of water is going to come out of your vegetables when you do that. And so then you pour off the water and then you pickle your vegetables. And that keeps the water that's in the vegetables from diluting your brine. And so if you go ahead and just pickle these vegetables right after you slice them, you're going to have brine that becomes a little bit more diluted over time. So your pickles will be a little bit less strong over time. And maybe you like that. Maybe you want to plan for that, in which case, you know, you'll want to wait a day or two to eat your pickles so that that brine can come to its final mixture a little bit more watered down than what you started with. So I hope those tips are things that you will find helpful. Again, this should be a pretty quick demonstration. There's not a whole lot to making quick pickles, just making sure everything is nice and clean, that you have all of the ingredients that you're planning on including, and that you cut up your vegetables pretty small. So I will get to prepping my ingredients, and I will be back to show you how to combine them all. All right. So I have cut up my cucumbers. I did most of the English cucumber and also 3 of the little mini cucumbers. And I think you can see what they mean by seedless. So there are still places where the seeds used to be, but there's no actual seeds. So that's what they mean when they say it's a seedless cucumber. I like the contrast between the small pieces and the big pieces. And then I chopped up some fresh dill to put on top. And the rest of my seasonings will be in the brine solution that I'm about to make. I also chopped up some garlic that I'll be using for both the mushrooms and the cucumbers. I have my cucumbers in this glass dish that I have a lid for, so this is the container my pickles will stay in. I also have 2 canning jars up here for my mushrooms. Let's move over to the stove. So there are my mushrooms. So I have already gone through the first step with these mushrooms. So I cut them into fairly small pieces. So this is a combination of white and cremini mushrooms. So the white mushrooms were already sliced. The cremini I cut into quarters. And mushrooms shrink quite a bit when you boil them. So I don't know if you've ever made anything that has mushrooms in it where you've boiled them, but they shrink by at least half when you boil them. So I had this pot pretty much filled with the chopped mushrooms, and then I filled it up with water to just barely cover the mushrooms. Added a half a cup of white vinegar, and then boiled them for 15 minutes. You want to be really careful whenever you're heating anything with vinegar in it. The vapor can be irritating to your nose or eyes, so just be sure that you keep it at the back of the stove, or kind of keep from leaning over it. Don't lean over it and breathe in any of the fumes. So I'll be heading back to these mushrooms in just a minute, but let's go ahead and work on our brine for the cucumbers. So in this pot, I already have a cup of just plain white vinegar. And you can see on here, down at the bottom, it says diluted with water to 5% acidity. So you want to make sure, if you're using white vinegar, most white vinegar is going to be 5%, but you can occasionally find something called table vinegar that is less. So make sure that you're using the 5%, just regular old white vinegar. Some other vinegar options are rice wine vinegar. So not rice wine, that's more like sake or mirin that you might use in Japanese or Korean or Chinese cooking. Make sure it's rice wine vinegar or rice vinegar. And that's going to have a sweeter flavor. You can also use apple cider vinegar. That will also have kind of a sweeter, more fruity flavor. Malt vinegar is popular in some British recipes. You can use red wine vinegar, but I would stay away from anything that's a long-aged vinegar, like a balsamic vinegar. You don't want to use those. So you do have a lot of options when it comes to the type of vinegar you use. Just stay away from the aged vinegars. But in both these, I'm going to be using the just regular white vinegar. So like I said before, I have a cup of vinegar, a half cup of water in this pot right here. You can adjust that to be more of a 1-to-1 ratio if you want a weaker solution. You can even use all vinegar if you want a stronger solution. And now we just need to add our seasonings. So I'm going to use a very basic recipe that calls for a teaspoon of peppercorns. And I'm not going to be too concerned that some have fallen in. I'm actually going to put a little bit more because these peppercorns are mixed peppercorns, and so they're not going to be necessarily as strong as all black peppercorns. Use a teaspoon of mustard seed. Again, I'm not going to be too concerned about a little bit of spillage. 1 bay leaf. Some of my chopped garlic. And then finally, we're going to need some salt. Over here is my salt. Not as much salt as you probably think. We think of pickles as tasting really salty, but this is just like 1 kind of rounded teaspoon of salt. Most of that salt taste comes from the vinegar that we just kind of misinterpret as saltiness. And then also, we need 2 teaspoons of sugar. And I find that for my taste, so 2 teaspoons is about right for me, but I find that some other recipes call for a little bit too much sugar. So that just depends on how much you like the sweeter types of pickles. And I'm going to put this on to heat. And now all I'm looking for is I want the sugar to dissolve. and the salt. And I want that bay leaf to kind of soften. And I'm really just infusing the flavors here. So I'm going to let this heat up, and I'll come back and continue stirring it in just a moment. I'm going to move over here to my mushrooms. So with my mushrooms, actually let me move right here. With my mushrooms, I'm going to go ahead and prep the jars. I will need to prepare a brine for them as well, and I need to use that pot that I'm currently using, so I'll come back in a moment and do that. But for now, I will go ahead and prep my jars. So I will need to put my garlic down in the bottom. So in this one, I'm not cooking the garlic with the brine, and that's going to make the garlic kind of have a more peppery flavor. If you like a milder garlic flavor, you'll want to maybe cook it with your brine. I'm going to chop up and add a little bit of dill, and this is all going to eventually float around in this jar, so I am going to layer it to begin with, but don't expect your layers to stay very visible. And then I'll just very carefully drain these mushrooms with a slotted spoon and add them to my jars. And I will keep doing that until my mushrooms are both portioned out between these two jars. I might actually want to wait a little while because I'm going to have some bay leaves to add to these jars, although it looks like I'm going to have plenty of room. I might even need to make more mushrooms, actually. The mushrooms shrink so much, it's hard to predict until you've done the recipe several times how much you're going to need. So I think I am actually going to need to make, to cook the rest of my mushrooms to fill up my jars here. Either that or just transfer everything into one jar, which I might also do. I might just make one jar of pickled mushrooms, and that's fine because I love garlic, so I'd end up with twice the amount of garlic in here, but that's fine. Come back over here. Again, I'm just waiting for everything to kind of dissolve and mix. That red thing is one of my peppercorns there. So I will be back in just a moment after my brines are ready and after I have prepped my mushrooms. So I'm going to go ahead and finish off this brine. So I'm just going to wait until it's heated a little bit, and then simply pour it over my cucumbers, and that's all there is to it. And I will prepare my mushroom brine as well. Okay, I have finished my cucumber pickles, and I will show you those in just a moment. Now I'm working on the brine for my mushrooms. So the brine for my mushrooms is 2 cups of water, 1 tablespoon of sugar, 1 tablespoon of salt, which I've already put in here. Now the recipe calls for 8 whole peppercorns, and the recipes for pickles are not usually specific about what kinds of peppercorns, and you can see they come in different colors. The black ones, I believe, are the strongest, and the other colors are more mild. So 8 peppercorns is not a lot. So if you feel like you want more, then go ahead and do more. I'm just going to kind of sprinkle some in. Get out that little flake there. And then we're going to add our bay leaves. So this calls for 6 bay leaves. That's quite a lot of bay leaves. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. And then once this mixture has come to a slight boil, we're going to go ahead and add our vinegar at that point. So some of these recipes have you heat the mixture before adding the vinegar, and I'm not quite sure of the science of why that is. It may just have to do with the fact that the vinegar is volatile, and so again, it can make that sort of irritating vapor if you are not careful when you heat vinegar. So we're going to let this come to a boil, and I am going to try this time half white vinegar and half apple cider vinegar. So let me move my camera back here a little bit. So this is apple cider vinegar, unfiltered with mother. So the mother, if you're not familiar with that, and I've already kind of disturbed this vinegar a little bit, but there's usually kind of what looks like a sludge down at the bottom of good quality apple cider vinegar and also red wine vinegar. And that is the bacterial colony that ferments the vinegar and gives it its flavor. So it's totally edible. It's not a problem. With my red wine vinegar anyway, when I used the last of it, the mother colony, it's a colony of bacteria, just kind of came plopping out the bottom. So you don't want a giant chunk like that in your brine, but a little bit of the mother is not going to hurt, and it's going to be inevitable that you have some of that in there. So we'll see how this changes the flavor of my mushrooms. Since I've already tried this recipe once before, I'm interested to see what happens. So we will leave this to come to a boil, and we will come over here. So there are my pickles that I've added the brine to. I did have to add a little bit more vinegar and water to cover the pickles. And you want to make sure that you kind of use a spatula and press and make sure there are no bubbles, that all of the cucumber pieces are being well coated. But I think these look quite attractive to have as a side dish at a picnic or potluck, family gathering. It's just really pretty, especially with the fresh dill, and you can put the bay leaf in there, the peppercorns. So I really like the way this looks. And it's something a little bit unusual. You don't see too much. These will be ready to eat, by the way, in about 30 minutes. So you don't even have to wait that long, and they'll keep in the fridge for a few days. My mushrooms over here I have ready. I've already chopped up the dill. I decided to change the container entirely and switch to this glass bowl since I didn't really, I had slightly too much to fit into one jar and not enough to fill two. So I just switched to the container that I was using to this glass bowl here. Chopped up my fresh dill, and now all it's waiting for is that brine. So I'll come back over here. I like to boil my brine, the kind that has bay leaves in it anyway. I like to boil it until the bay leaves soften. I'm hoping that that means that they're releasing some of their flavor. One of the things that's going to make a critical difference in how your pickles taste, or just how anything that you make with spices and herbs tastes, is using fresh spices. So if you are in the habit, like me, of just letting things sit in your pantry for a long time and expire, the expiration date on herbs and spices doesn't necessarily mean that it's not safe to eat. More what that's going to mean is that they're not really going to have much flavor anymore, and so it's going to be like adding nothing to your recipes. So these bay leaves are probably a little bit older than they should be, but you can try to get into the good habit of going through your spice cabinet every now and then and getting rid of the things that are a little bit too old, and just buying new fresh spices and herbs whenever you need to make a new recipe. I'm going to go ahead and start adding in my vinegar. So this calls for 6 tablespoons, which is not a lot, maybe, for 2 cups of water, but we've already boiled our mushrooms in a vinegar and water solution, so they actually already taste quite vinegary. So we don't need to add a whole lot more. So 1, 2, 3 of the apple cider. And I'm not too concerned about the color of this brine, because I found last time that the brine got a little bit discolored anyway from the brown mushrooms, the cremini mushrooms. Perhaps if you use white, that wouldn't happen. All right. And in regards to nutritional value, I'm not really sure what the pickling process does to the nutritional value of vegetables. You know, a lot of vegetables, cabbage, things like that, are really high in vitamin C, and vitamin C is very fragile. So if you're interested in that, that might be something that you might want to look into. That is the reason I leave the skins on my cucumbers, not just because I don't mind the way they taste, but also because that's where the fiber and the nutrients are concentrated. Just want to be very carefully pour the brine, and I am going to end up with too much, it looks like. That's fine. I kind of expected that. So you'll just have to decide, you know, do you want the peppercorns in there? If you do, you'll just kind of fish them out into your mixture. Probably 6 bay leaves is kind of a lot to leave in there, so I'm going to remove a few. So let's just leave 3 in there. And there are my mushrooms. Again, another really pretty dish to take to a potluck or just have around the house. These are really good with any kind of meat dishes, steak or chicken. So there you have it. Quick pickles. Really is a really quick process. I encourage you to try some of these recipes and try your own. Try some of the international recipes. There are recipes out there for pickled onions, again, pickled cabbage, pickled beets, pickled peppers, pickled carrots, cauliflower, just all sorts of things. So think of a vegetable you like, and there's probably a pickle recipe out there for it. And I hope you enjoy experimenting and exploring the world of pickles.